Imagine waking up to breaking news. Overnight, the US has slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian goods, a 25% tax on most exports, and a 10% tariff on energy. The reason? The US cites an economic emergency, linking the tariffs to concerns over illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking at the border. But what does that actually mean for Canada?
Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum would be entirely unjustified. We will stand up for Canadian workers. We will stand up for Canadian industry.
For decades, Canada and the US have enjoyed a strong trade relationship, one built on trust, shared industries, and deep economic ties. But with a single policy change, that foundation is suddenly under threat. Now, the ripple effects of this decision won't just be felt in government offices or corporate boardrooms. They will land squarely on the shoulders of Canadian workers, business owners, and consumers. To understand the damage, let's talk numbers. Canada isn't just a neighbor to the US, it's deeply tied to it. 77% of all Canadian exports go south, making up nearly 20% of Canada's entire economy. That's trillions of dollars flowing back and forth across the border every year. But trade isn't just about statistics, it's about real businesses, real jobs, and real livelihoods. Think about Canadian farmers who export wheat, beef, and dairy to American markets. Think about auto manufacturers in Ontario whose parts are shipped to assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio, or energy producers in Alberta whose oil and gas fuel industries across the US. Now, suddenly, all of that is at risk. Companies must decide. They either have to absorb the losses, raise prices, or cut jobs. And let's not forget the consumers. A tariff doesn't just hit businesses, it's a hidden tax on everyday people. A 25% tariff means a Canadian product that once cost $100 in the US now costs $125. Now, that price hike could shrink demand, forcing Canadian businesses to scale back, cut wages, or even shut down altogether. So, what happens next? The tariffs were delayed, but the threat still looms. If they go into effect, the shockwaves will be immediate. Industries will scramble, stock markets will react, and consumers on both sides will feel the pinch. But what does immediate impact really mean? Are we talking about layoffs, supply chain chaos, price surges at grocery stores, or maybe all of the above? Now that's exactly what we'll break down today. How Canada would take the first hit, which industries will suffer the most, and what it means for everyday Canadians. Before we dive into the damage, let's quickly break down what a tariff actually is. Think of tariffs as a tax, a fee that a country places on imported goods. In this case, the US is proposing to tax Canadian products before they even reach American shelves. Here's how it works. If a Canadian company sells lumber, steel, or even food to the US, that product now gets hit with a tax before it can enter the American market. This tax is paid by the importer, usually a US company buying from Canada, which means higher costs for them and ultimately higher prices for consumers. Canada isn't just sending a few products to the US, it sends 77% of its total exports there. That's nearly $500 billion worth of goods every year. Tariffs would make those goods significantly more expensive for American buyers, forcing them to either pay more or find suppliers elsewhere. And that's where the real problem begins. American companies aren't going to sit back and just absorb the higher costs, they'll start looking for alternatives. If Canadian steel suddenly costs 25% more, a US manufacturer might switch to Brazilian or Mexican steel instead. If Alberta's energy exports become too expensive, refineries in the US might source more from domestic suppliers or turn to the Middle East. Even agricultural products like wheat or beef could face stiff competition from countries with lower trade barriers. This shift won't happen overnight, but the preparation might already be underway. Since the tariff was announced but put on hold, American importers could already be exploring other supply options, renegotiating contracts and testing alternative suppliers. Now, if the delay was intentional, it might not just be a pause, it could be a strategic move to help American businesses adjust before the tariffs actually hit. And once they do, Canada might find that some of its biggest buyers have already moved on. This is what makes the situation even more dangerous for Canada. Once American buyers get used to sourcing products from other countries, they might not come back even if the tariffs are lifted later. Canada could lose key trading partners permanently, causing lasting damage to industries that rely on U.S. demand. And let's not forget, higher prices don't just hurt Canada. American consumers will also feel the pinch. A Canadian car part that used to cost $1,000 might now cost $1,250. Grocery prices could rise as tariffs make Canadian food exports less competitive. The effects will be felt on both sides of the border. But for Canada, where trade with the U.S. is a lifeline, the pain would be immediate and severe. One estimate predicts Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.6% in the short term just from these tariffs. That's recession-level damage. A contraction of this size could slow down the entire economy, leading to lower wages, declining business confidence, and fewer investments. And there's another problem. Tariffs don't just cause temporary pain, they can permanently raise prices, making everyday life more expensive for Canadians long after the tariffs are removed. Beyond the immediate hit, the uncertainty itself is damaging. When businesses don't know if trade rules will change, they hesitate to invest. Expansions are put on hold, hiring slows down, and the economy stagnates. A country dependent on exports like Canada can't afford this kind of instability. Job losses would be significant. Unemployment could jump by 2 to 3 percentage points, pushing thousands of Canadians out of work almost overnight. That's not just numbers. That's a devastating blow to Canadian workers and families. Losing a job doesn't just mean losing income, it means struggling to pay rent, higher stress, and long-term financial instability. And the hardest hit will be those in manufacturing, agriculture, and energy, the backbone of Canada's economy. Tariffs don't just impact exporters, they also directly raise prices of imported goods. This pushes inflation even higher, making daily essentials like food, gas, and consumer goods more expensive. The Bank of Canada estimates inflation could jump almost a full percentage point, 0.77%, because of these tariffs. That may not sound like much, but when inflation is already sky high, even a small increase can break the average consumer. And it gets worse. The Canadian dollar would likely weaken, making all imports even more expensive. And that means more inflation, which weakens the currency even further. This is a vicious cycle that makes life harder for every Canadian. The economy is already in a fragile state. Canadians are already struggling with record-high inflation, and this extra pressure could be the breaking point. With wages failing to keep up and businesses scaling back, the effects of these tariffs could cripple consumer spending and push the country closer to a full-blown recession. Even Canada's already stressed housing market would take another hit. Tariffs raise prices on building materials like lumber and aluminum. This makes housing even less affordable and could slow down construction even further. The already strained housing market and existing shortages would worsen, and potential solutions would be delayed due to increased costs and slowed construction. Certain industries face a direct hit. Energy and materials are most vulnerable. Gas prices could spike by 70 cents per gallon. Job losses? Potentially hundreds of thousands across industries. Lumber prices could increase by 15%, and aluminum costs might jump instantly. This threatens manufacturing jobs, where over 1.8 million Canadians are employed. The average car price could rise by $3,000, leading to potential job losses in the automotive sector. Reduced travel, especially in border towns, would put tourism and hospitality jobs at risk. Farmers could face decreased demand for exports, leading to surplus produce and financial strain. And tariffs on electronic components could increase production costs for tech companies, potentially leading to layoffs and reduced innovation. Ultimately, Canadians would see higher prices across the board, not just on specific items. Imported goods get pricier, and that cost gets passed down. For example, household appliances like refrigerators and washing machines could see noticeable price hikes. Expect fast jumps in prices for perishable items like fruits and vegetables as supply chains are disrupted. Higher inflation means your dollars buy less, eroding purchasing power. Now, to combat rising inflation, the Bank of Canada may increase interest rates, making borrowing more expensive for everyone. This means higher mortgage payments for homeowners and increased costs for loans, further straining household budgets. Canada announced it would retaliate, hitting back with tariffs on $155 billion of U.S. goods.
Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action. Our response will also be far-reaching and include everyday items such as American beer, wine, and bourbon, fruits and fruit juices, including orange juice. It'll include major consumer products like household appliances, furniture, and sports equipment, and materials like lumber and plastics.
While Canada's retaliation would also hurt the U.S. economy, potentially shrinking it by almost 0.5%, the U.S. can afford this hit for now. In contrast, Canada faces immediate and more severe challenges due to its higher dependence on U.S. trade. The U.S. might see inflation rise on imported goods, but it is unlikely to face a severe economic downturn from these measures. And remember, this research outlines potential impacts, but the real world is unpredictable. Tariffs don't exist in a vacuum. There are ripple effects, countermeasures, and unpredictable consequences. If both countries keep raising tariffs and imposing new restrictions, we could see a full-scale trade war. And that doesn't just hurt Canada, it damages supply chains, businesses, and consumers on both sides of the border. For now, the tariffs are on hold, but the threat remains. The mere uncertainty is already causing businesses to hesitate, investors to rethink decisions, and markets to react nervously. The longer this drags on, the harder it will be to recover. Ultimately, these findings underscore why stable trade relationships matter. Both the US and Canada have everything to lose in a prolonged economic standoff. Trade wars are rarely won, they're just lost more slowly by some than others. The only real solution is negotiation. If policymakers can find common ground, they can protect industries, jobs, and consumers on both sides of the border. Because at the end of the day, when economies are this interconnected, one country's economic pain never stays isolated, it spreads. And if Canada takes the first hit, it won't be the last.